If your church has a bookstore or lending library, you will probably find lots of nonfiction books in there, such as Christian living resources, Bible studies, and discipleship material. But we know that people also get their discipleship training through stories and songs. Well, almost every church has the songs part covered, with singing and worship and maybe a whole ministry team devoted to music. But should church bookstores and libraries offer more fiction to cover the stories part? We might even ask, should churches have story pastors to help disciple others through story, just like the music minister does this through music? What could this story pastor look like? Welcome back to Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven, where we explore fantastical stories for God's glory and apply their meaning to the real world Jesus calls us to serve. I'm E. Stephen Burnett, not a story pastor. I do, however, publish Lorehaven.com, and I help co-author the nonfiction book, The Pop Culture Parents.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and currently I am reading way too much nonfiction, and that is probably why this topic has bubbled to the top of my mind. This is episode 109, How Should Local Churches Support Christian-Made Fantasy?
Zach, the best kind of nonfiction, I think, is actually about fiction. That's why we have articles at Lorehaven.com. In fact, among the team, we've been talking a lot about the purpose of articles and what kinds of articles we want to have in the future. I, however, like you, also read a lot of nonfiction. I enjoy both nonfiction and fiction in balance. And that's why I'm really interested that you proposed this topic today about the hypothetical story pastor.
I think I would love that as a title. I think that would be so cool. But it really shouldn't have to be so mystical or like eccentric. I mean, because like you said, we already have worship pastors. So why not a story pastor?
Yeah, when I say stories and songs, I kind of apply that to every form of popular culture, every kind of artwork that Christians make. Some people say, well, that leaves out games or sports or things like that. But I think that one way or another, everything that people make is related in some way to a story or a song. Churches do have the songs covered because the scripture tells us to worship God in our local churches through singing. But I think that you can make a strong case that we also need to be institutionalizing in some way, organizing the way that we use stories for discipleship. If for no other reason than scripture itself is a capital S true story of stories. And it includes fictional parables and other examples in there. If Jesus thought that people ought to learn through communicating fictional stories, then we as the church should do the same. And we have done the same in Christian bookstores and obviously through things like Lorehaven and Christian publishers who publish fiction, including fantastical fiction. But your point, Zach, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about this, is that maybe we ought to have this kind of thing more organized at the local church level and not just in parachurch groups or authors or publishers.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think it's going to take that kind of intentional effort. This idea came to mind first when everyone was talking about Disney. And it's like, oh, Disney's so terrible, and look what all the garbage they're pushing on children. And I'm like, well, okay, I agree with that, but I think the bigger problem is that we are relying too much on Disney for stories for our families. Like, why is the church doing that? Like, why do we feel like Disney has to supply us with stories? Now, I'm not saying that every church should start writing books and everything, but as the church, where is our own emphasis on our own stories? Secondly, some Christian creators I follow were sort of complaining a little bit, and I agree with their complaint that a lot of churches, pastors aren't really highlighting Christian art and stories. So while they're complaining about what Disney is doing, they're not really pointing their congregation towards the stories that Christians are creating. And so I thought, aha, that's the missed opportunity here. We've discussed why the church should talk about fiction, why we need stories as part of our discipleship diet. So we'll save that. We've got other podcasts on that. If you're new to the podcast, go to episode 50. That's where we really start talking about why do we need fiction, fantasy, science fiction. But for this episode, we're going to talk about how this could work. And we're going to use the imaginary role of the story pastor.
I look forward to finding out about this. And when Zach and I were brainstorming this topic, I had some objections, a little pushback. So at times, podcast may actually include a little friendly debate because although I believe that the local church should endorse the creation of stories and stories as discipleship tools, I'm not entirely sold on the idea of a hypothetical story pastor role. I think that local churches have enough going on as it is, But I would love for this to happen at the congregational level. I would love for people to at least have kind of a naturally occurring democratic process where are discipling others through story. So that's my take, at least going in. Let's see if I'm persuaded by the end. Before we get into the thick of it, however, we want to go over the first sponsor for this episode. Once again, our sponsor is the Realm Makers 2022 conference. Speaking of discipleship through story, you've got to have mentors and relationships and professional development and writers conferences in order to make the stories. And if that's you, if you have anything to do with that, you will want to attend the Realm Makers 2022 conference, either live in person or virtually, because it's a hybrid event. Here's the description for the Realm Makers conference from July 21st through 23rd, 2022. Are you excited to take the next step in your speculative fiction journey? No, not an actual trip to space, time travel, or forging your own sword. Joining us for Realm Makers 2022. This year's annual Writers Conference will again offer the event in person in Atlantic City and live online. So even if you're not ready to travel in July, you can still see the teaching in real time. Every class will be live streamed for our virtual attendees. Whether attending in Atlantic City or online, all attendees will have the chance to connect on the Realm Sphere in a dedicated conference space in our online community. Realm Makers 2022 is an amazing value because this year, every attendee gets access to replays of every class available through the Realm Sphere. No matter how you attend, if you have a manuscript you want to pitch to our participating agents and editors, you will be able to do so. You can register for Realm Makers and get more information in our page at lorehaven.com/podcast sponsors, or go to our show notes for episode 109. Zach, unfortunately, you won't be making it this year because you have another event that takes priority for you. But I and several of the other Lorehaven staff creators will be there, as always, with our Lorehaven booth at the in-person event for Realm Makers.
All right, well, let's head over to the concession stand. And since we're all talking about church, we're going to go eat some casserole. That seems to be the thing there at the church concession stand. So, Stephen, as you mentioned, we realize that a lot of churches are short-staffed and a lot of ministries happen through volunteers. And so, while we're exploring a speculative church position, like a staff position, your real life mileage may vary for your local church. Maybe you go to a church with just one or two people on staff. And so you can, maybe this is too hard to imagine and too impractical, but that's okay. This could take the role of a volunteer position. Although I am, this is a podcast all about imagination. So why not dream big with a, imagining a corner office where there's a little placard outside that says "Story Pastor," so and so. And while this podcast, we mostly focus on Christian fantasy and sci-fi, we're going to be talking a little more generally about Christian fiction. So kind of, we're not, favoring one type of genre or even age group. It's just more generally Christian fiction. I think that's probably going to be a more realistic starting place for this sort of idea.
So the story pastor is going to have to deal with your Amish prairie romance. Huh?
You know it. Everything.
Little Boy Goes to Heaven books from the 2010s.
All of the bonnet fiction, yes. And just to make this extra clear, this idea of a story pastor, this is not primarily about harnessing secular pop culture for ministry use. We often kind of joke a little bit about articles that are entitled "The Gospel According to This Movie" or "Finding Jesus in This Novel."
Meh.
And this idea has its place, and maybe it'll be a footnote in one of the sections here. But our focus still is on Christian stories, and particularly books.
Let me add another concession or two. First off, when people say the church always, or the church never, or the church this or that, I tend to get a little squishy. I like to say something like I said, actually on my Facebook page a couple of days ago, quote, "Please stop saying the church when you really mean the churches I have known, or the churches that I believe have hurt my friends, or the social group to which I feel most sympathetic. Call things by their proper names." I think I'm going to stick to this one because I've seen a lot of rhetorical drift when people say the church, blah, 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 the church, blah, blah, blah. I think someone might even say if Lorehaven publishes something like, well, the church is doing this, like, we are not the church. We're Lorehaven. Like, and if I said it, like, I'm not the church, I think people have a little semantic creep going on there. If Catholics who actually have a pope and more church organization are not all responsible for the actions of one bad Catholic or one bad Catholic church, then certainly Protestants are not responsible for the actions of one bad Protestant or one bad denomination or something, and we're less organized than the Catholics. So I just want to be careful when we're talking about stuff the church does or doesn't do.
Amen to that. Well, we're going to look at 3 different ways that a story pastor could operate. And I've kind of denoted these as cultivator, shepherd, and creator. So we're going to explore each one of those here. So our first section is that the story pastor as cultivator. So, Stephen, what I kind of see as the story pastor's role is, how to best utilize the existing body of Christian fiction. You mentioned in the intro, what if the church library or the church bookstore didn't just have all this nonfiction and Bible studies, it had a bunch of stories written by Christians. There's quite a bit of Christian fiction that's already out there. I mean, even, secular bookstores have the Christian fiction section. So it's not like this is a unknown category or a strange idea. And, if you have a church library, you probably have some of these books. I guess you could almost say the first role is librarian or bookstore kind of manager. But I chose word cultivator intentionally is that they're finding the best fiction. And so they are, reading a lot of fiction, they're reading reviews. Probably what they need to do is recruit a team, recruit some volunteers, find a lot of people that love reading, and then find the stories that are going to be really good for your congregation. Now, a while back, someone was talking on another podcast about Barnes and Noble and what made one of the radical shifts Barnes and Noble went through. And it was the fact that as a national chain, Barnes and Noble would put the same books on display in the front of the store in every location. Like that was the norm. And then they got bought out. And so they started reorganizing and they started placing different books by each location. And so they tried to emphasize, okay, what are people in this city reading? Well, we've got some information on that. And then Amazon Bookstore came along and they actually just closed. But they took that to the even higher degree. They know exactly which books are being bought and shipped to people in a certain city. And so at all of their little bookstores, they put all of those books on display. For some reason, they closed all their bookstores. I don't know all the details. But that is sort of the idea that a story pastor is not just looking at, okay, what are the most popular books out there, but like, what are people in our church actually reading? What are people in our city reading? What are people in our denomination reading? And really highlighting those. Along with this, highlighting the classic stories. Proverbs says, don't move an ancient boundary stone. Like, don't just throw out books that have been timeless classics just because they're old. But certainly, let's find new great stories that are in circulation. So I think there can be a temptation to chase the new. Like I said, we don't want to just throw out old things, but we do have to keep an eye out and an open mind. I mean, there's 1 million books being published every single year.
I really like this idea, and I realize that most local churches are already doing this. If there is a guy or a class of individuals who are spreading around what they feel is the best or most beneficial books, it's the guys doing this for nonfiction, and they're not called story pastors, they're just called pastors.
Or the resource
We're already
pastor,
doing
maybe.
this.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, you if your pastor has an office on site, if it's that kind of church, he almost assuredly 99.5% of the time has bookshelves in there. And they're going to have books on counseling and theology and maybe even some fiction here and there. Zach, back when I was in print journalism, I remember interviewing a United Methodist pastor in the town where I worked at the local newspaper. And he had shelves not just with really good looking nonfiction in there, but he had some fiction as well. I was happy to see some Peretti on his shelf. And it wasn't just there for decoration either. I pointed that out. I said that I was a fan, and it was the Darkness novels and some others. And he was also a fan. And he was a good guy. I mean, say what you will about United Methodist as a denomination. He was one of the good ones. He was a gospel-centered chap, and he was bringing that into his teaching. And clearly it was reflected in his library, which wasn't just nonfiction, but also fiction. So maybe if the story pastor could build on just what the pastor does, because the pastor or pastors, if you have a team of elders, are already doing this with books. Just this past week, as we're recording, a bunch of pastors and Christian leaders got together in Louisville, Kentucky for the apparently final Together for the Gospel conference. I've never been to that conference, and now I guess I never will, but I've been to similar events, and pastors, elders, folks like that are constantly sharing books. They, of course, have a conference bookstore, and there's curated titles in there, probably exclusively nonfiction. So as I think about it, you've already won me over a little bit because I realize pastors, elders at churches are already doing this for nonfiction. And if they're not reading books, frankly, they probably ought not be a pastor. Now we just need to push them a little bit and go, hey, people get discipled through fiction too, not just nonfiction.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, nonfiction we certainly need. We need Christian living resources, devotionals, Bible studies, but that's only one half of our brain. The stories disciple our imagination. We've talked about this a lot. Again, go back to episode 50 where we talk about this and why we need fiction. It's not just an optional thing. I think we actually need it. So we have to find stories that are going to help us inhabit, worlds and characters that are going to point us towards the Lord and help us think in ways and feel in ways that are glorifying to God. We can't just logic our way to truth all the time. We have to explore it. We have to imagine it. So yeah, and I really do think this probably is a separate role from the typical resource pastor. I think his job is probably already overwhelmed. Now, I have seen this at churches where it's like the family pastor is the person that's putting together kind of the library or the bookstore. So they're the one that kind of has because they're a family pastor, they're thinking of all different ages. Like, okay, your teenager needs to read this, your 8-year-old son needs to read this, your college student needs to read that. So they're already kind of thinking through nonfiction resources. But they're also probably doing counseling and a lot of other things. So that's why I think this role of building a fiction library probably needs to be a separate role, because I think it is a different wheelhouse in a sense. But along with just finding books and recommending books, the next part of this, of being a cultivator, I think, is finding resource guides. These would be book club kind of things. These would be how to discern. This is frankly what we put out at Lorehaven. Like, here's a review, here's what to discern, and maybe a little bit more in depth resource guide for a book, something a few pages or so long. Don't reinvent the wheel. Like, look for what's already out there. A lot of authors put out discussion guides for their books, and so you can look for those. Lastly, finding commentaries and resources on pop culture stories. We can't pretend like our congregations are not going to read secular fiction. So we need to know what people are reading. Churches have played around with this a lot. We've maybe highlighted a book in a sermon, or done a sermon series based on, a Harry Potter house or something like that. But I think we need to shift our focus to what fellow believers are producing. We need to be discerning about and strategic with very popular stories. We need to at least be aware of what people are talking about. But I think that should be a side note to the much bigger project of highlighting Christian stories. The story pastor should focus mostly, maybe 90%, on Christian stories. Because, Stephen, imagine how weird it would be if the worship pastor at your church spent all his time analyzing the Billboard Top 20 songs, and just listened to the radio and like, oh, what are the most popular songs? What are winning Grammys? And I'll see if I can sort of incorporate that into worship. I mean, that'd be really weird. Like, we would never do that. I mean, yes, there are churches that might play a U2 song or something. But again, that's the exception to the rule. We're mostly singing worship songs to Jesus. So I think this story pastor role should be mostly focusing on stories that are made to glorify Jesus.
I agree. And not just because I have a soft spot for Christian made fiction, and not just because that's what Lorehaven does. Certainly, Lorehaven would be an invaluable resource to this hypothetical position, hired or voluntary, at a church that can afford that. I have a few other thoughts about this. First off, just to clarify, an assumption that we're making, kind of an axiom under this, really comes out, Zach, when you're talking about how this individual would not necessarily be constantly analyzing the top hits on radio or whatever's cool in the hip hop scene. Some churches do that. Some parachurch Christian pundits have done that and still need to do that. There will always be a need to engage what's going on out there in the world. But I think an assumption that a lot of Christians, in fact, I would say, I might even dare to say that the church has this assumption, and just overgeneralize there. Let's just leave it at a lot of Christians assume that the only reason to engage popular culture or to cultivate stories or to analyze the top 10 hits or whatever is to evangelize. And we've gone over this in a previous episode or two of Fantastical Truth. If we find them, we'll link them in the show notes. We don't believe the purpose of stories or engaging stories is to evangelize. In fact, I think that evangelism can actually become a kind of a hollowed out idol when you look at it like that. We believe the purpose of engaging and creating stories and songs is to glorify God, which includes but is not limited to evangelism. So I guess, Zach, that'd be my question for you. Is the purpose of the story pastor to evangelize the lost, or to disciple the saved, or a little of both, or maybe more of one and less of the other?
Yeah, you got me in a bit of a corner here, since I am very much about evangelism and missions.
Well,
Just
no
in
one wants to
my
speak against that, God forbid. But I think it becomes a false event. It becomes, I said, a hollowed out idol, like not even a substantive idol. You know, you're wrapping knuckles on it, and it makes a hollow sound. I don't think that that stuff is really evangelism for a lot of Christians, especially in like the last 10 or 20 years when people were writing all of those Finding Jesus in or the Gospel According to articles. I dare to say, I think that the creator was largely working through some of his own thoughts and issues with his own subculture. Man, that church back home that I grew up in, you know, they didn't let me watch the TV. They didn't let me listen to the music. They only let me listen to lame bands from the Christian 90s bands. And a lot of people, by the way, don't think those are lame bands anymore, at least not the good ones. They now look back on that with some nostalgia. But the person writing these articles and trying to engage the popular culture, I don't think he looks back on it with nostalgia. I think he looks back on it as a time of immaturity and lack of freedom. So he goes out and he writes articles about the gospel according to The Simpsons or Breaking Bad or any of those things. And I don't think that I'm not getting that from your thought here. This
Yeah,
seems a more
no.
developed version of that idea.
Yeah, I think there can definitely be a danger in saying, "Hey, let's find all the popular books in our culture and let's go read those so we can, relate to our neighbor." And it's like, well, there should be some of that. I think every Christian's diet should include understanding what people are reading. I mean, the Apostle Paul, he quoted the Greek poets back to them, so he knew what
Yeah,
they were
Acts
reading.
17, yes.
Right. But if that's all that a Christian is doing, if they are just reading things to reach others, then they're going to be really empty. Like, that's not going to fill you up. You need good Christian stories to baptize your imagination. Like, you need it to fill your heart with truth and beauty and goodness. You don't just need stories as tools or as weapons or whatever. Like, the stories that you read should most of all be for your own benefit. I mean, we sing worship songs for the same reason. It's for the benefit of drawing near to the Lord and to worship him. And so, looking at stories mostly as an evangelistic outreach, I'll talk about that a little bit in the next section where that could work. But yes, I think mostly this is a discipleship approach, the same way that a Christian living book that a family pastor recommends is for discipleship purposes.
Another question, Zach. You've mentioned specific types of pastors: family pastor, music pastor, was it resource pastor?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with these terms. Are they distinctive to the church you attend or a denomination you know?
I would say it's the bigger churches are going to have more staffed positions and so
Right.
more specialized roles. But this is a role that other pastors could play, or that, we said volunteers could even play in a smaller church. I think the average church size in America is actually 120 people. So it's probably just a couple of people on the church staff. This is probably for most churches, probably not a staff position they could add, but more of a role that someone takes on, or a volunteer position.
Gotcha. In that case, perhaps a title change would be in order. You would not necessarily be an ordained individual with an MDiv or a paid position like a children's pastor or youth pastor. If you're not a story pastor, perhaps you could be a story steward, which also builds off of your phrase here, the story
Yeah.
pastor as
The story
cultivator.
cultivator. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, this goes back to the older, more ancient calling of God the Creator on His people in Genesis 1:28.
Yeah.
Not to evangelize the world, but to steward the world, to go out and make stuff using God's stuff. That's what cultivate means. The root word there is the same as culture. God is commanding His people to make and enjoy culture in the world. Before Jesus must also command his people to go out and make disciples in the world. But the disciples in the world, get their restored relationship with God so they can go back to the purpose of making culture in the world. You got to have the Great Commission and that cultural mandate from Genesis 1:28 at the same time. The Christian's job includes both. It is not limited to one or the other.
Now, again, I am dreaming big. So I am dreaming of a staff position with the title story pastor. And yes, they have an MDiv that they went through a theological,
good. At a good
training
school?
at a seminary. Yes,
At a
that's
good
all
seminary?
about this. Yeah.
Okay, so not one of those bad seminaries you hear about
That's right.
on the
let's
interwebs.
let's not go there.
Yeah, no, just
But,
whatever one you're thinking of, that's the one we're talking about. That's a
Right.
bad seminary. Okay.
Yeah. So certainly this could be accomplished in a, like I said, in a part-time role or a volunteer role. But yes, I am thinking like if there was a person at the church, I would want them to cover all of these bases. One final thing I'll say for this part one of Story Pastor's Cultivator is, do you remember when everyone at your church was reading The Shack, or before that Left Behind, or perhaps one of Ted Decker's books, or whoever? Like, do you remember when that was just, it was such this buzz about, oh my gosh, there's this awesome Christian novel. It's called Left Behind. Everyone is reading it. Like, whoa, I got to read that. And that was so exciting. Now, put aside whatever you may think now of these books. That was an exciting time in the church when everyone you knew going to church was reading the same novel. And so what I'm basically suggesting is let's make that a regular thing. Let's make that like every month there is a book that we're all buzzing about and talking about. And there is a person on staff with the church that is driving that. So in other words, we're not just leaving it to chance or whims, that we are taking a proactive approach to creating that buzz, and not just for the sake of buzz, but for that togetherness that we feel. That's what was so exciting, was when you knew you could talk to someone about a book because everyone was talking about it.
It seems to me too that the role of cultivator is not just to grow the vegetables, but also to pull the weeds. For example, if
Yeah.
back in the 2008, 2010, the heyday of the Shack, lots of Christian pastors on the internet were pulling the weeds in that book, and we've certainly done a few belated weed pulls ourselves, because the Shack is not all that great when it comes to certain ideas of God and His character. But if you had an official position back then someone could, with the backing of the church, an elder team, the officially recognized leadership structure of the church, you could make it a little bit more official and say, hey, we know a lot of you are reading The Shack. We know a lot of you are reading Left Behind. It's okay to read. It's okay to explore these ideas about God and whether or not God would appear as a jolly black woman in a shack somewhere, God the Father, Mother, whatever. Papa, I think his/her name was. A little fan fiction gender bending stuff going on there. I guess the author found it meaningful. Point being, a local church could officially say, okay, it's okay to read this book, but here is our faith statement. Here's the position of the church. Here's what we understand from scripture. God is not a woman. He would not appear as a woman. He identifies as this. Here's some good stuff our story pastor, story steward, whomever found in the book.
Yeah.
Here's some bad stuff. You can look up this link at our church's blog or his own blog or whatever. But here's what we think about that. But in the meantime, if you're going to read it, okay, we have this book club. We're going to go through it. Then hypothetically, the local church leadership is leading there rather than kind of having this parallel religious movement going on,
Right.
sourced by fandoms and other groups of fans on the internet.
Yeah, you're not just reacting to those things. And even taking the Left Behind for a second, when I was when that came out, I was going to a premillennial, pre-trib rapture, dispensationalist.
Oh, they're going to eat that stuff up like crazy. Yeah. But if you were going to a Presbyterian church like I was at the time, they'd be turning up their noses at it, unofficial like, well, we're post-millennial here. We don't go for that mark of the beast stuff. That's corny.
Yeah. And so, you may go to a church that doesn't agree with the book, but maybe doesn't think it's bad. It's just like, okay, we have a different view, but hey, why don't we read this book anyway? I like my favorite Christian sci-fi series, Lamb Among the Stars, as an eschatology I don't agree in, but I love the books. I think they're fantastic. And that's all I'm saying, is that you don't have to just, pick a book that agrees exactly with your church's faith statement, but hey, let's study it together. Let's read. This is a Christian author. Look, it's not going to be crazy. It's not going to be insane. Maybe there's some things we disagree with. There might be some bad theology, but that is the process of discernment that we should always be doing. And it's just a little bit easier to do that. With Christian books, we get to kind of put it on easy mode when it comes to discernment. We're not reading a book written by the worshiper of some other God. Like, we're reading books by people who worship Jesus, and maybe they have different understandings, different beliefs. And yeah, there might be some bad ideas, but we can still discern those together, and let's just do it intentionally. So
Well, Zach, I'm already on board. I would volunteer as tribute myself for Story Steward if that could be a thing. I'm certainly interested in kind of ratifying what probably myself and a lot of our listeners have already drifted into being. And just my encouragement, I guess, for folks listening to the podcast to go to a church that doesn't hate this kind of thing, fiction, fantastical fiction by Christians and otherwise. Maybe nominate yourself as a tribute. Just maybe go to your elders and say, "Hey, here's a fun little title I heard on a podcast somewhere, Fantastical Truth. You can go listen to it there, spread the word, and rank us highly on Apple Music and all of that." But apart from that, hey, just let it be known that you think these are your gifts, and don't just use those gifts as a fan of fiction, as an individual, or even a member of the Lorehaven Guild community or any of that. If you can, make sure that your leaders at your church know that you want to use these gifts, these enjoyments of stories, to serve the local church. Make yourself a story steward, even if you can't be a story pastor. But as you say here, Zach, let's move to chapter 2 of this discussion. The story pastor is not just a cultivator. In your reckoning here, the story pastor serves as a shepherd. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so now that the church library is stocked, there's plenty of books in the church bookstore. There's a newsletter that goes out once a month about, hey, we're checking out these books.
This sounds awesome.
Yeah, this is the church I want to go to, right? So I love my church, but this is what I want to see happen at my church, I should say. But now that all that's going and there's, this love of reading and everything that's going on, I think the next step is fostering a theology of fiction, and not just a love of fiction, but
amen times
yeah,
10.
but really taking a deep look at the purpose of fiction, what God intended for stories. Because again, we've explored this a little bit, but this is where someone with an MDiv would be able to take this really to the next level. And this is not so much like English class kind of stuff. Like, although if you've got an English degree, even better. Then you can talk even more deeply about literature and good grammar and stuff like that. But what I really see as the shepherding role of the story pastor is actually leading a book club, going through a book with a group of people, or even like leading a group of leaders who then lead book club, and leading those discussions. So not just saying, hey, go check out these books, whenever you want, but like, hey, let's do it together. Let's walk through this book and really explore the ideas, the worldviews, the consequences, the themes in this story. Let's go through that together, maintaining a steady diet of fiction within the church. So this isn't just a project. I've been to churches that love programs that did like, hey, this month we're doing this, and the next month we're doing that, and next month we're doing that, and it was just kind of like exhausting because it was like, man, I can't keep up with this. Like, I love all these ideas, but I like us just to pick one. So this would be a normal thing at this church. Now, this is not saying everyone has to do this. Not everyone's a reader. Not everyone's a fiction reader. Not everyone's a fantastical genre fiction reader. And so this isn't going to be for everyone, but that's okay. There's a lot of books that not everyone reads. I still haven't read The Five Love Languages. Naomi has been sadly asking me since we got married to read that book. And I am just confessing now, I need to read that book. I haven't read it yet.
Wow. I don't remember. No, I think I have read that one, but it's been a little while. It's one of those books, though, Zach, that is just so mainstream. You will even hear the jargon from Gary Chapman's book dropped among people who would not ever darken the door of a church. And it's kind of good to know that a lot of these Christian books have made it out into the world. But as I see your idea here of the story pastor as shepherd, it is taking that leadership role that we mentioned earlier, maybe for books that are super popular among the church, but also bringing attention to books that otherwise might go unnoticed.
There you
Whether
go.
it's a nonfiction book that your pastor brings up, like, hey, I realize that a lot of people in our church struggle with this particular trauma. Here's a really good book. I found it together for the gospel about that. But then you also might say, hey, here's a Christian made book that was published in 1996. And a lot of people thought it was corny at the time, but it really blessed me. And I think maybe going through this book would not only be an enjoyable experience because it's a well-made book for what it tries to be, but also could be a very healing experience as you track with this character on her hero's journey and discover how she heals from the trauma that she experienced.
Right. Now, the second part of this role, the story pastor is shepherd, is so while the first role is really shepherding readers. But the second part of this role would be shepherding writers. So what I envision
Oh, I
here
see what you
is
mean. Okay.
for the story pastor to find Christian writers in the local church or the local community, like in the city, or perhaps in their denomination, and finding them and leading them in a group, like nurturing them, pastoring them, and giving maybe workshops or something like that, like giving practical things. Now, this is not to say that the story pastor has to be a writer among writers, but finds ways to really pour into their lives. Because if you've got writers in your church, I mean, what a great resource if you're the story pastor, because it's like, hey, I can not only tell you about a book, I'm helping shape this book by discipling the person writing this book. And so I'm helping form some of the ideas in this book. And so I think that is just would be a huge, huge win to have that story creation process be happening in the church with the story pastor contributing to it. Now, at my church, we have what we call a story team. This is totally different than what I'm talking about. Our story team does nonfiction. So we do articles like written stories or photographic stories or video stories, and these are just someone's 5 to 10 minute testimony of something that happened in their life, maybe something really hard they went through, or something that where they grew a lot, or where God brought them to faith, or they went on a mission trip or something like that. And our story team would put all these stories together. But what we would also do is everyone that was on the story team would have a workshop like once a quarter. Man, Stephen, these were fantastic. This was led by people in the church, but also other people that our church leadership knew about. There was like a screenwriter that came once. There was a photographer that came. There was a musician that came. And I felt so blessed to be a part of that. Like, I was like, I can't believe I'm getting this for free, and they're bringing me breakfast, and they even gave me a free mug and a hat. Like, this is awesome. Like, I feel so loved and so blessed to be a part of this. So the story pastor would be leading the storytellers in the church. So not just the writers, but the other kinds of storytellers that you've got, and maybe even the musicians. So I see this existing very much in symbiosis with the worship team. That's how it is at our church. The story team and the worship team are very symbiotic. You could almost think of this as an arts pastor.
Or culture pastor, perhaps.
Yeah, culture pastor. Yeah, I think we've had Mike Duran on the show before, and I think he has an arts pastor, or he went to a church that had an arts pastor. I believe I've heard him talk about that.
Or he tried to have an arts pastor type thing.
Yeah,
Mike's
I think
very
he tried to
passionate
pull
about
it
that.
off.
Yes.
Yeah.
And even in California, that may have been a tough sell to some churches.
Yeah. I went to Rick Warren's church, Saddleback, a few years back there in, was it Orange County? And they had an art gallery. Like, as you walked into the church, there was paintings up, and they're really cool paintings, all made by artists at that church. So these aren't just things they bought at Target or a flea market, or just, things that popular artists in California. These were artists at their church. And I love that the church was discipling and shepherding their own artists, and then letting them show their expressions there at the church. And so this would be the point, whether or not, the next best-selling author comes from this church. I think just that cultivating those talents and shepherding those people in the church could be a really big win.
I'm going to grab a late snack from the concession stand and simply point out, I think we've already obliquely referred to this, but the organ is always shinier at the church across the street. As you're describing this hypothetical environment, I mean, once I get past some of the initial shine, I start thinking about all the problems, and I may not go over all of these here. But one of them, of course, is obviously resources. You're speaking about Saddleback, or churches that can actually afford the position or the time or the personnel to have a children's pastor or a youth pastor. A lot of churches, they ain't got but one pastor,
Right,
and he's
right.
already burdened. And some churches are, basically church plants, and the guy is working at Starbucks Monday through Friday, and then he prepares for his sermons on Friday and Saturday nights. I mean, some churches are younger, they're struggling, they have limitations of space and time. I get it. I mean, this is definitely, like you said, we are dreaming. This is the ideal. So that's a small wrench thrown into it. But Zach, also, I've just been handed this very large, imaginary, hefty metal tool, and I'm going to throw it directly into the conversation, completely unplanned. Based on your title of pastor, the roles that you're talking about here, with the possible exception of shepherd, could be done by a woman. But a lot of Christians, and I think both of us would fall into this category, believe that the biblical role of a pastor, as in a teaching elder in a church, according to 1 Timothy 3 and elsewhere, should be limited to men because reasons that we will not elaborate on. But why could you not make the story steward, not pastor, in order to prevent confusion? Why could the story steward not be a woman? He or she is already doing the library. Like women, there are many more, I would say, many more women writers in the church than male writers. Certainly, there are women involved in music ministry, and some churches will have, a woman as the music leader, even if she's not a pastor. I believe women can be deacons, if not church elders. Like, could the story steward be a woman?
Yeah. So again, to our listener, your mileage may vary. You may go to an egalitarian church. You may go to a complementarian church like Stephen and I.
Not the same church, though. We should disclaim that up front. Yeah, Zach and I go to different churches.
Yeah. Steve and I live 20 minutes apart, but we go to different churches, of course. So going back to what I was saying at the beginning, I am imagining a very specific, staffed position at a church. I'm calling it the story pastor because I see this, again, I'm dreaming big. I'm imagining this position on par with the worship pastor who is part of the elder team. So at our church,
there would need to be a man then.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. This would be a part of the elder team. Now, again, some people out there go to egalitarian churches. They have a worship pastor that's a woman. And so I'm not making as big of a deal about that. What's most important to me in this exercise of imagination is this role being a top line role at a church, that someone is in this position with as much, resources behind them as the worship pastor. So if your church has a worship pastor that is a woman, then, no big deal for the story pastor to be a woman. Anyway, I go to a church where the pastors and elders are men. We do have women that lead worship. We do have women that lead Sunday school classes. We believe that eldership is reserved for men because of the passage you mentioned. But women do serve at our church. I was just talking to my pastor about this recently. This is a big aside. But basically, the way our church breaks it down is the role of the pulpit, and so the role of teaching the church is reserved for men. So yes, I am imagining this person, the story pastor, as a teacher of the church. So in my church context, that would be a man, but in other churches, that could be a woman. That's not as important to me as just the role itself. Let me go back to something a minute ago, though, a little bit less controversial. You asked me in the first section about, should this story pastor be using books as evangelism? And I said, I think there is a way to do that. And it's in this shepherding role. I mentioned that as a shepherd, that this story pastor should be leading a book club or leading leaders of book clubs. Well, one of the ways that you could do evangelism is by inviting your neighbors to a book club. So now, are your neighbors going to come and read a Christian novel? Well, I don't know. You might have a friend, you might have a coworker, you might have a neighbor that's like, okay, maybe I should give Christianity another chance because I've met, Joe and Sally neighbor, Joe and Sally, coworker, and they're cooler than I thought, and maybe I need some faith in my life. I'll check out a book, I'll read a fantasy book. That's fine. Oh, it's Christian. I don't mind too much. So this would be aimed towards a very warm kind of person. So someone who's not hostile to Christianity. Now, maybe the book club could take on a secular book once in a while. And then you could really invite in a lot of other people, a lot of people outside the church. Look, that's up to the discretion of the book club and the story pastor. But I think that is a way that you could kind of augment this, is not just discipleship, but evangelism too. I still think it's primarily a discipleship role. Yeah, why not make it a little evangelistic some of the time? I think that's a great idea.
I think that is a great idea. And I like the proportion there. I mentioned earlier that we had been talking among the Lorehaven staff creators about the purpose and scope of Lorehaven articles. And one thing we've been talking about is how much to have articles about finding biblical truth or discernment issues in popular movies, like superhero movies and stuff. Obviously, I've gotten away with a Snyderverse article or two, and similarly here on Fantastical Truth. But mainly at Lorehaven, we want to emphasize the excellent Christian-made novels in the fantastical genres that no one's talking about. You can go to other websites and get reviews of the latest Marvel or DC or Star Wars movie, whereas you can basically only go to Lorehaven and a few other sites and get information about Christian-made books that your kids might like or that you might like. I would like to see that that emphasis reflected in a story pastor or a story steward. I guess real quick too, the reason why I mentioned the whole male female thing is that I know at Lorehaven and at Railmakers, and we know so many skilled, talented, discerning Christian, deeply Christian female authors. And I would like to think that any of them would be perfect in a role like this, but
Sure.
for the whole label of pastor. I think that a woman can teach when it comes to skills like this that are not necessarily sermons. Like I'm not egalitarian, but I don't see why a woman couldn't teach a mixed group Sunday school class of a certain grade. You know, I've learned so much from female podcasters and female leaders, to where I understand the label of pastor, as in teaching elder, should still be reserved for a man, just because 1 Timothy 3 seems pretty insurmountable there. But something like this, I think that men and women alike have a lot to say about the role of the Christian in culture creation. And I don't think this position should be egalitarian, because I don't think it necessarily needs to be a pastor position. But in the church that can do it, okay, great. You know, elevate them that way. But I'm thinking about my church, or maybe smaller churches among our listenership. Perhaps a female listener to this podcast could find herself in the role of story steward, even if it's kind of self-appointed after talking with your elders, like I was mentioning earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about how this would play out in my church, because I think you ask a very good question.
We all
Like,
will, yeah, because I'm thinking the same. Yeah, my church.
Like, how could a woman play this role in a complementarian church? And the title would not be pastor; it would be story leader or something, or story steward, as you said, story shepherd or something. What it would mean is that this would sort of be like an optional thing, like it's a Sunday school class, like I said, or it's a seminar or whatever, workshop. In which case, our church has plenty of women that do that. What it would mean is they wouldn't be able to lead from the pulpit on Sundays. Not that I really see this person in a, sermonizing role, but I don't know. It's tricky. That's probably a whole other podcast to figure out what that would practically look like. So let's just go to part 3 here. So chapter 3 is story pastor as creator. Now, frankly, this third role is optional. Or just like every worship pastor is not a composer, neither should a story pastor be required to be an author or writer. But a few are going to take on that role. Again, in my church, we create a lot of our own music. So we have a couple of the people on the worship team, they write music, which is awesome. I love that. But we also, play plenty of songs from other churches. But in this role as a creator, the story pastor would, I'm going to get in trouble, but I'm just going to use male pronoun just to make things simpler. But again, go back to part
I won't
2.
cancel you, and you won't cancel him either, will you, gentle listener? You better not.
So where I see the story pastor fulfilling this role as creator is writing their own stories. So these could be short stories, these could be novels, these could be screenplays. I don't think it really necessarily matters, because this isn't just like, again, when you think of the first role of cultivating, that's their primary role. They are finding stories that already exist. Novels take a long time to write. It might take 1 or more years per each novel or screenplay. When I say this is an optional role, what I really mean is this is the least important role of this pastor, is that they are not there to create every story that the church is going to read. That would be insane. Like, they would totally burn out. So what kind of fiction they create is almost irrelevant. And somewhat more important than writing fiction would be writing his own resource guides for these Christian stories. So you find a great Christian novel, it doesn't have a discussion guide, you create one. And also writing commentaries and resources on pop culture stories. Because again, there's a lot of great resources out there. Focus on the Family has great, movie reviews, and here's how to discern this story. But they don't cover everything. And so, maybe the story pastor finds a movie that everyone's talking about and no one's written about. He goes out and writes something about it. And then, hey, that gets to bless other churches. So just being very generous.
Well, until the story pastor program gets started in your denomination of choice, I must point out that is stuff that we're hoping to do at Lorehaven and have already done. We've actually already been talking about making discussion guides, like sometimes based on the challenge questions that we've been sharing in our Lorehaven Guild Discord community. Free to join if you just sign up at lorehaven.com. We do monthly book quests every month, and every single one is focusing on a Christian-made fantastical novel. Now, Zach, you've mentioned the story pastor. Obviously, we're not trying to limit him to fantastical fare. It could be stories of any kind, mostly Christian-made stories, but also some secular-made stories, just whatever your church needs. But Lorehaven can only go so far, even if we are doing a new discussion guide about a book per week or per month. Your mileage may vary, as you said, Zach. Everybody's church is different. The personalities are different. The sin struggles are different. The history of trauma is different. Your discipleship needs are different. And so a more locally based story pastor, even at a large church, can address those differences, can vary his approach in anything that he's creating based on the needs of those around him. That's the whole point of having a local church, as opposed to just overgeneralizing the church. God has put us in families, smaller units. It starts with the individual needs, the family needs, and the local church needs. And only there do you go out to like the broader Christian or evangelical subculture. Like Lorehaven reaches that subculture. We're at more the bigger level there, but only a local church level story pastor could create materials that are needed and useful to the people around him.
Now, let me give a couple examples of where I have sort of seen this work out in the real world. The first example would be Francis Chan. He was a pastor, and he's a speaker. He might be serving in overseas missions now. I know he's talked about that. I don't know if that's just a temporary thing. But Francis Chan wrote a children's book called The Big Red Tractor. This is a story about, people in this village that are pushing around this tractor manually to try to feed their family and harvest all the crops. And then there's a farmer that's like, this is really hard, and he finds this instruction manual for the tractor, and they figure out the right way to use it, and they're able to make more than enough food for themselves and to share with others. And the whole thing is a parable of the Holy Spirit's role in the Christian and in the church, and how just literally the idea of the Holy Spirit bearing fruit in someone's life through this analogy of the tractor. And that was a great little book that came out 2010, I believe. And I think there was even like a little short film that went along with it. As far as I know, this is the only story that Francis Chan ever created. But it just, that kind of got me thinking, what if he was doing that a lot? Because he wrote that while he was a pastor. So he saw some of the struggles of his church and wrote a story to address that. And then now that story is blessing other churches. I just think that was fantastic. Another person that's doing a similar thing is Jared Wilson. So he is a contributor at the Gospel Coalition, but his actual title is Author in Residence at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's mostly written nonfiction, but he's written a few fiction titles. One is Echo Island, which is like the speculative kind of mystery. Another one is Otherworld, which is a little bit more of a sci-fi mystery, and it has UFOs in it. And as soon as I saw that, I'm like, oh, that's going on my list, Stephen.
That's your jam.
Yep. I have to read that now.
Absolutely.
I'm not as familiar with Jared's work, but I've read some of his nonfiction articles. I'm like, okay, this guy has a really good head on his shoulders. And that's really cool that he's an author in residence. So that's his job, is to write these books. I don't know what all else he writes or does, but I imagine that's taking up quite a bit of his time. People that write full time, that's their full-time job. And so the story pastor's creator, this might be more of a side job, because I think those first two categories of cultivate and shepherd are actually more important to the local church. But yeah, we should encourage writing of new novels. And again, maybe this also means this story pastor finds other writers in the church, in the community, in the denomination, in the region, or in that genre, and learns from them, leads them, teaches them, shepherds them. It's kind of, we said in the second part, but really he's got his ear to the ground. And he knows where good stories are going to be coming from. And then he's creating his own along with it. The last example I want to give is a little bit different. It's Alex Kendrick. So he is the associate pastor of media for Sherwood Baptist. And then they've created Sherwood Pictures, which has created all kinds of Christian movies. Everyone's got their opinion about movies, but look, I just love that a local church said, we're going to start a movie studio. And it started with, I think, like a $25,000 budget. And each movie has like doubled or tripled in budget. And, some of their movies are getting critical acclaim. Like, I don't know if they're going to win awards. And I secondhand heard Alex Kendrick talk at this event where he said, "I'm Alex. I make cheesy movies and I own it." And I love that.
Good for him. Yeah.
I love it. He's just very self-aware, just very self-deprecating. But the purpose of what they did with Sherwood Pictures was to make movies for their church, for their community. A lot of the humor is it's very specific to Georgia, I believe is where they live. It's very specific to their, Southern culture. It's not, but I love that too. As a Southerner, even though I'm a Texan, I love Southern humor that's not making fun of Southerners. It's just like we're having a good laugh at ourselves, but we're also, we find things funny that people elsewhere are not going to find funny. So, again, they started that for their local church, and now they've obviously gone, much bigger, but that was always their focus. They are making films for their church body.
Zach, I thought I'd have more pushback about this section, and I don't really. If for no other reason than you've emphasized the story pastor as creator, as something that the story pastor could do if and should the need arise. My concern here is that, I mean, not like anybody's going to be so influenced by us, but if, for example, a big time pastor, a Tim Keller or somebody at a conference were to say, hey, y'all need to go out and make basically a position on your staff that's going to be the poet laureate. And yes, he might cultivate the church library, and yes, he might lead a book club, do some shepherding, but also like he needs to recruit the writers, and we need to get this going to the local church level. If you try to do that sort of thing from the top down, it's probably going to fail, or it might even become cheesy. But I think it's more an issue of a local church being limited to working with and being called to the resources and needs that they already have. This sort of thing has to be organic from the ground up. I wouldn't want a big church with money to throw away to try to do this from the top down. I think that would not only be ineffective, but it might even be, I wouldn't say unbiblical, but it might blur the lines between Christian vocations. And this is what I mean by that. The elders in a church, the teaching elders, have a specific job to help disciple people through the word of God. I think the vocations, the offices get a little do some overlap if you're talking about the music pastor or the youth pastor. Like in theory, the youth pastor is not the lesser pastor, as we all joke about them in the skinny jeans and fog machines. The youth pastor ought to be a guy, who is just as qualified, or even if he's a junior member on the teaching elder team, like he ought to be able to get up and give a sermon to everybody on a Sunday morning if the main teaching pastor gets the flu. Optimally, in a church that has these gifts, like everybody on the teaching elder team should have these gifts, including a hypothetical story pastor. But I'm not sure that means that the clergy, the leaders of the church, are meant to be the only mentors in these areas. Like, do you then also have a plumbing pastor? Do you have a construction manager pastor? I understand that stories are a little different because it goes back to that original cultural calling. But then should you have a farmer pastor, who applies Christian principles to the growing of crops? Like, well, that can happen, but I think more organically, pardon the pun, among the members of the church. Like the 1 Timothy 3 standards for teaching elders in some way ought to apply to everybody, not only every man, but often every woman in the congregation. Husband and one wife, not quick-tempered, shouldn't be a recent convert, needs to be mature, take care of your family, or else you shouldn't be pastor because you can't even take care of your family. How can you take care of the church? All that stuff is in 1 Timothy 3. Lastly, Zach, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is a quote from C.S. Lewis that I often use when it comes to Christians arguing about how or whether the church should lead in political efforts. Lewis, back in the 1940s, was already talking about the church and social morality, with an aside, a very important aside, about how or whether the clergy, the church leaders, should do cultural work. And this is the relevant paragraph. I'll skip through the first and then directly quote the rest. He says, "People say the church ought to give us a lead. That is true if they mean it in the right way, but false if they mean it in the wrong way. By the church, they ought to mean the whole body of practicing Christians." And he goes on to say that most people, when they say that, mean, well, the clergy, the church leaders, the pastors ought to put on a program. They ought to train us about how to apply biblical principles to economics or border security or anything like that. I'm translating, of course, some of the modern issues here. Here's where the direct quote resumes. He says, quote, "But of course, when they ask for a lead from the church, most people mean they want the clergy to put out a political program. That is silly. The clergy are those particular people within the whole church who have been specially trained and set aside to look after what concerns us as creatures who are going to live forever. And we are asking them to do a quite different job for which they have not been trained. The job is really on us, on the laymen. The application of Christian principles, say, to trade unionism and education, must come from Christian trade unionists and Christian schoolmasters, just as Christian literature comes from Christian novelists and dramatists, not from the bench of bishops getting together and trying to write plays and novels in their spare time." End quote. Zach, I don't think you're talking about the bench of bishops as a hobbyist here, trying to do something from the top down. I think you're talking about someone on the bench of bishops who naturally has this talent, who then is being recognized for that talent and is receiving that label on their door as story pastor or story steward or whomever.
Okay, so I have a lot of thoughts about this, so buckle up. So I'm going to go back to the first thing you said, and I'm going to kind of frame everything around that. You mentioned about, should the church have a poet laureate on staff? And you think not. I don't necessarily disagree, but I don't think that that is invalid. And we are not a culture anymore where artists have patrons, but
Right.
there was a period of time where that was very common. Michelangelo, had a patron to paint the Sistine Chapel, right, and to do other works of art. And so I don't think that a church would be wrong to hire someone just to write novels. I think that could be really cool. But I think churches need more than that out of this story pastor role. Now, on the flip side, I think that someone who wants to be the story pastor at a church is probably going to be a writer. It's probably going to be someone that wants to create things. And they may be disappointed to learn about all these other, everything else in the job description that we talked about in the first and second sections. And so their actual writing may be 10% of their time, or it may be their side job, their nights and weekends role. But now, why not a plumber pastor, you said? Well, okay, and I'm just going to say this bluntly, but let me, I'll elaborate. Does plumbing disciple us?
Yeah.
That's really what it comes down. Does
Yeah.
and again, nothing wrong with plumbing, electricians, carpentry, whatever, teaching, trade unionists, whatever. But are those things meant to disciple us? And, Jesus used stories to disciple us. And that's really what I come back to.
Amen.
Is that the stories that he told, we are still telling each other today. We are still sharing those stories, and we're creating new stories in the spirit of discipleship through story, and even evangelism through story. So that's where I find the basis for this. And again, I think it's very closely tied to worship, Pastor, because we use worship, or we use music to train ourselves in how to think. And we use stories for a very similar purpose. The real tricky thing economically about all this is that when you have someone in a nonprofit organization that is being paid to create things, he's going to get paid whether those things sell or not. And that, economically is not always a great idea. Now, if that's the purpose of the organization, there's plenty of ministries that their entire job is to create materials. And so those materials get sold to whoever. And I'm mostly talking about nonfiction materials. Or there might be a big ministry that they have a couple of people whose job it is to create materials. And those people are going to get paid a salary, whether or not the things they create sell very well. And look, there's a lot of people that will probably want to talk about this in the comments, but that can be a dicey thing. And so for a church to hire someone purely to write novels, it may not be such a great idea. Now, again, I would love that role. I would love to be hired by a church to do nothing but write sci-fi novels. But I don't think it's going to be the right use of money, because then my stories aren't being driven by, is there a readership for them?
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and it's not being reader focused. But also it could be really tempting for that story pastor just to be holed away in an office. Like, I'm sure there's some introverts that would love this, that just get a corner office in the church. They just write all day, they go home, and they don't have to worry about the bills. Like, it's paid. But being a church role, that in being a pastoral role, the focus is on the congregation. The focus is not on what they're creating, the stories they're creating. Now, I think they wouldn't be able to help themselves. I think anyone that wants this role is going to want to write a book, but I think it's these other things that should take more of their time.
I agree with that. And that's the difference between what Lewis was warning against as an aside. Like Lewis's line here in Mere Christianity is talking about the church influence in the world. What you're talking about is the church influence on itself, on the
Yeah,
church.
right.
Internal affairs, not the church going out and putting novels and plays from the bench of bishops out into the world. Lewis was not on the bench of bishops. He gave a sermon or two, but in terms of clergy in his own church, I believe the Anglican Church in England, he was not a pastor. He was not a teaching elder or whatever you call it in the Anglican Church, not my denomination. He was, in a sense, a lay person, very professional for what he did, a scholar of medieval and Renaissance literature and languages. That was his job. He was not on the bench of bishops. So he's kind of implicitly talking about himself there. The Christian novels and plays need to come from Christian novelists and dramatists. Well, that was C.S. Lewis. That was maybe a lot of people or a few people at your church. That's the people who are appearing on this podcast, who are writing Christian-made fantastical novels. Some of them may be a pastor here and there, but they're doing this in their spare time because they enjoy it. It's coming from their heart level desire and enjoyment for these stories, and hopefully to serve a need that they have in their congregations, not because they're being told to do it by a bench of bishops over them. I think that really is the difference, is that whether or not you're hiring somebody for a paid position, it's a need that's arising naturally from the church. And I think you're right, Zach. It would take a special individual who would not only be the cultivator and the shepherd, but also be the creator, because you're talking about an ambivert or someone who maybe is an introvert who can get along well with people and at least fake being an extrovert and then grow into it for the glory of God and the good of their fellow church members. Or you're talking about an extrovert who just does this like maybe 5% of the time, making stuff. I'm looking at you and I and like going, okay, well, what are we? I don't know whether I'm an introvert or an extrovert. I used to think I was an introvert, but then at events, specifically about issues like these or talking on the podcast, like I just come alive, and you can train to push your energy levels further. You really, really can, or at least I can. And I don't want to project that on everybody, but it would take a unique personality to do this kind of thing. And that means that the church, maybe the church, local churches shouldn't just sit back and wait for this personality, though. Maybe you got somebody who could turn into this kind of person in the congregation. I might could. My church is fairly small, but like I said earlier, I could volunteer as tribute and then maybe at least be a story steward, even if I don't have an office or a library with my name on the door. Yes. Well, you're not the story king of Gondor. You're the story steward of Gondor. And hopefully you suffer a better fate than poor Denethor.
There you go. Well, to your listener, if this fictional job title appeals to you and you want to look it up on Glassdoor or whatever people are using, LinkedIn, I don't think you'll find it there, but hopefully one day we will see it posted there. I can't remember where churches post their job listings, but if you'd like to offer us some feedback on this role or these different functions, cultivator, shepherd, creator, did we leave something out? Is there some other function of this story pastor you think should be filled, or do you think this could take some other format? We would love to hear from you. So send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com, or you can leave us a note on social media. Just look for Lorehaven.
Speaking of story pastors, I'm sure that even if we don't have a lot of them now, we're going to have a lot more of those types of folks in the new heavens and new earth. And that leads me to our comm station, lit up with replies regarding our last podcast episode and a few articles that have appeared at lorehaven.com. One hero in the Lorehaven Guild, our exclusive Discord community, enjoyed our episode 108 of the podcast, the one about resurrection with Tim Chafee. This person remarked, quote, "It's challenging to think about how the fact of physical resurrection, both Christ's and our own future renewed life, ought to impact how we live and think and imagine." End quote. I love that. That is pithy. The challenge there is absolutely what we're about on Fantastical Truth. Not just trying to meet the needs of the church today or the local churches today, but looking forward to eternity when we're going to have massive libraries. Zach, I was looking at your article from this time last year talking about the New Earth libraries. We've had Earth Day. Everybody's talking about saving the present Earth. I know for a fact that Jesus will save the present Earth, and that books and reading and literature and delight and culture will continue in some way in that eternal afterworld. That's something I really look forward to after resurrection.
Well, yeah, there's kind of two different mindsets you could take from this, right? With reading, you could say, well, everything on this earth is going to burn, and so you better read all those secular books now before they're burned up. Or you could look at it like, hey, we're going to have all kinds of Christian books, and the Christian books now are going to last forever. They're going to be in the New Earth Library, so you might as well get started now. Like, don't let that to be read pile up so much. I mean, you'll have plenty of time later, but since you're going to be reading Christian novels in the New Earth, why don't you read them now?
And you may also have certain secular made novels in the New Heavens and New Earth too. I don't know if they'll have stickers on them, but you will have sanctified eyes.
The VidAngel versions.
Yeah, you will be raised, as Tim Chafee said, in a spiritual body, and nothing will be able to corrupt you anymore, not even a book with some false ideas, which we may keep around in the New Heavens and New Earth for the curiosity of them. Man, I can't believe I used to believe that. It'll be really interesting to go back over that stuff. By the way, speaking of cautions about stories, that was the subject of Marion Jacobs's recent article we published last week. That is called Sensual Scenes in Fiction Pose Unique Temptations for Women. Glad Marion wrote about that. I can't write about that, but that's why we have different story stewards, we might call them, among the Lorehaven staff creators. One reader remarked openly in a comment to that article, quote, "Thank you for this. I have struggled with lust for years, mainly aided by books and TV. I know to look at reviews before watching now, but books are a lot harder. Even books marketed as Christian get uncomfortable sometimes, and it's often hard to know which those are without stumbling into them. By then, my emotions are already engaged, and it's hard to stop. Thanks for this, Marion. I always find your articles thoughtful, and this needed to be said." End quote and amen. I really appreciated Marion's approach to this article. It is sensitive, it is compassionate, but it is also firm and grounded in Scripture. I think you'll particularly benefit, male or female reader, from her comparisons to the Samaritan woman at the well, and especially her finale at the end, asking someone, imagine you're at your best friend's wedding. Are you enjoying it because she's getting married and you can go along with her joyful journey there? Or are you kind of wishing that you were her? That's just a powerful finish, and I think something that I can apply when I'm enjoying someone else's happiness, whether it's fictional or real, even as a man.
Well, where are we going next week, Stephen?
Next on Fantastical Truth, we're actually going to do an informal sequel to this episode based on a few phrases that you've dropped, Zach, into previous conversations here on the podcast. You've mentioned that I think we may be moving into a golden age of Christian-made fantastical fiction. Occasionally, I have pushed back on that. I think that we're not there yet. I think it would take a lot more to get us there, if we ever get there at all. In fact, we may not arrive in a golden age for Christian cultural creation of any kind until the aforementioned New Heavens and New Earth. But in case we were to get some kind of a golden age here on the present Earth, what would that look like? What would we expect to see? What kinds of stories would we expect to be flying off of the shelves? What would a golden age look like for Christian-made fantastical fiction? And we will explore that in our next episode. Meanwhile, whether or not your church has a story pastor or a story steward, whether or not maybe you could step up, go talk to your elders and say, hey, I just heard about this hypothetical idea. What are the chances we could make it real? I'm basically already doing it, and I'd like to get organized about that. I'd like to serve the people in my church who are already looking into stories and enjoying them. This is something that local churches need to take seriously. Whether or not you do that, always be discerning the stories that you enjoy and look for ways to exercise your gifts, being a fan of fantastical fiction, whether or not it's made by Christians. Use these gifts well in your church as we continue to seek and find His fantastical truth.